A year of scandal. Top stories from 2019, including the head of the Diocese of Buffalo stepping down following claims he mishandled clergy sexual abuse allegations. Cardinal Pell's appeal. What's next for the most senior member of the Catholic Church to be found guilty of sexually abusing children? And where things stand. Analysis of the bishop's actions this year. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, December 26, 2019. Good evening, I'm Jason Calvi. I hope you're having a Merry Christmas. And tonight, a look at some of the top stories from this year regarding the abuse crisis in the church. We begin with new leadership in the Archdiocese of Washington. Archbishop Wilton Gregory has been a leader in the church's efforts to address the clergy sexual abuse crisis. He was installed in May and admitted his appointment comes at a time of choppy seas with scandals surrounding Washington's two previous archbishops, Cardinal Wuerl and Theodore McCarrick. Archbishop Wilton Gregory takes command of the Archdiocese of Washington. With this official decree, Pope Francis moves the Archbishop from Atlanta to the nation's capital. Gregory takes over after months of scandals, months of anger, months of questions.
I do accept the pastoral care of the people of God in the Archdiocese of Washington. I resolve to serve faithfully the spiritual needs of this local church.
Thanks be.
Gregory led the U.S. bishops in 2002 when they approved the zero-tolerance policy for priest abuse. Members of his new flock tell me they hope their shepherd will bring healing here.
And it's important that we have the kind of leadership that I think I'm hearing about coming from Atlanta and Archbishop Wilton. So I'm just excited.
I hope all the stuff that going on in the past will be able to be put aside and we move on to a new chapter. Mosquito. Yeah. And we move on to a new chapter in life.
Gregory becomes the district's first black archbishop, setting him up to likely become the country's first African-American cardinal. In U.S. history, 26 bishops of African heritage have served the country. Roughly 100,000 or 15% of the Washington Archdiocese is of African or Caribbean heritage. Nationwide, Pew finds only about 5% of blacks are Catholic.
It is truly exciting, truly historic. I wouldn't want to miss it. I took off from work. Something in my spirit and my gut said, be here today to just witness a part of history.
71-year-old Archbishop Gregory gets to work in a divided Washington, a divided nation, a divided church. And beginning last year, the abuse crisis embroiled the Archdiocese of Washington. Its previous two leaders were implicated in the scandal, Cardinal Wuerl and his predecessor, Theodore McCarrick. In February, Pope Francis defrocked McCarrick. It came after a Vatican-backed investigation concluded he sexually abused minors and adults over his long career.
Theodore Edgar McCarrick, Archbishop Emeritus of Washington, D.C., guilty of the following delicts while a cleric: solicitation in the sacrament of confessions, and sins against the sixth commandment with minors and with adults, with the aggravating factor of the abuse of power.
It's the first time a cardinal has been dismissed from the priesthood for abuse. In October 2018, the Pope reluctantly accepted Wuerl's resignation after he lost the trust of his priests and parishioners in the months following the release of the Pennsylvania grand jury report. That report accused Wuerl of helping to protect some child-molesting priests when he was Bishop of Pittsburgh.
Monsignors, auxiliary bishops, bishops, archbishops, cardinals have mostly been protected. Many, including some named in this report, have been promoted. Father Schlert, identified in the report, is now Bishop Schlert. Bishop Wuerl is now Cardinal Wuerl.
Wuerl also faced widespread skepticism over his insistence that he knew nothing about McCarrick's misconduct and flip-flopping in the media about what he knew and when he knew it. From D.C. to Buffalo, Pope Francis this month accepted the resignation of Buffalo, New York Bishop Richard Malone. It follows widespread criticism from Malone's staff, priests, and the public over his handling of allegations of clergy sexual misconduct. Mark Irons has more.
The Vatican announced the resignation in a brief statement, adding that the Pope had named Bishop Edward Scharfenberger of Albany to run the Buffalo Diocese temporarily until a permanent replacement is found.
My heart just goes out to you.
The resignation comes after Malone learned the results of a Vatican-mandated inquiry into the Western New York Diocese and its handling of abuse cases. In a statement, Malone said he concluded after much prayer and discernment that the spiritual welfare of the people of the Diocese of Buffalo will be better served by a new bishop who perhaps is better able to bring about the reconciliation, healing, and renewal that is so needed. The diocese has been named in more than 220 recent lawsuits by people who allege they were sexually abused by priests. Many of the allegations date back decades, long before Malone's arrival in Buffalo in 2012. Pressure on him to leave was intense. Malone has admitted to making mistakes in cases involving adult victims, but he had firmly refused to resign and insisted he wanted to stay on the job to see the diocese through a process of renewal. In September, a group of lay Catholics that had been working with Malone to restore trust in the church instead joined in calls for his resignation. The group, the Movement to Restore Trust, said it received word of Malone's departure with a mixture of sadness and relief. In a press conference this morning, Bishop Scharfenberger had a message for the people of the Diocese of Buffalo.
I am here for you. I'm here to listen to you. I'm here to walk with you, and I'm here to help you heal. I would prefer to convey that message by what I do and not just by what I say.
In the past year, 2 key members of Malone's staff went public with concerns about his leadership, including Bishop Malone's former secretary and his executive assistant.
The Buffalo Diocese has paid out over $18 million to more than 100 victims under a compensation program set up last year. Since August, it's been named in a wave of lawsuits under a New York state law. It suspended the usual statute of limitations and opened a 1-year window for victims to pursue claims no matter when the abuse happened. The day that resignation was announced, Mark Irons spoke to the bishop's former executive assistant.
We are now joined from Buffalo by Siobhan OConnor, former executive assistant to Bishop Malone. Siobhan, welcome back. You resigned from your position after 3 years as Bishop Malone's executive assistant. You accused him of covering up clergy sex abuse. What's your reaction now that his resignation has been accepted?
Well, it's quite a relief that it has officially taken place. There have been some false alarms, some high hopes. So it's quite a relief that it's now official.
And the bishop had been under pressure to resign for some time now. What do you make of the timing of all of this announcement? And are you disappointed that it has taken this long?
Well, it certainly is quite a shock that it did take this long. It is disappointing, and it's just increased the distress here in our diocese for parishioners and survivors alike. The timing suggests that finally Rome realized through the report that was generated through the apostolic visitation and through the continued media coverage, they must have either realized what an embarrassment it was or realized that it wasn't a self-correcting situation.
What message does this send to the survivors of clergy sex abuse?
Well, I hope it reminds them that their voices are so important and so powerful. We're very grateful for their courage in coming forward. They have changed this narrative tremendously, and we owe so much of this to their courage.
Can you talk just a little about your frustrations? You've been involved in this so closely. And again, back to the resignation, why has it taken this long, and how do you feel about it?
Well, for me, it really speaks to the fact that the hierarchy of the church is really in many ways not in tune with the needs of the people, because we certainly have been clamoring for change here for well over a year. And for a while, I thought maybe Rome had us on mute, that they were just tired of hearing about Buffalo. So I really do think it speaks to the fact that there's additional changes that need to be made, but I'm trying to take it as a positive first step in that direction.
And as a lifelong member of the Diocese of Buffalo, what are your hopes for the diocese going forward?
Well, I hope that we can begin a new chapter now. I was encouraged by Bishop Scharfenberger, our interim bishop's remarks this morning, and I want to maintain an optimistic spirit. It's so easy to be cynical now because of everything we've endured here, and I respect people's skepticism, and I think we have to have a healthy skepticism, but I still want to be optimistic. There's always hope, and I do believe that our diocese can emerge from this a stronger diocese, and hopefully the survivors will be strengthened as well.
So this resignation, It's the right step forward, and it really will bring healing and restoration and trust. Is that the hope?
Yes, it is. I believe that it was that first necessary step. Bishop Malone had come to symbolize so much of what was wrong and dysfunctional in our diocese, and by having him removed, I believe that we can now move forward. And it really is it's like an early Christmas gift to be able to have this change happening now before the end of the year.
Siobhan OConnor, former executive assistant to Bishop Malone, thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you for having me on, Mark. Pleasure to speak with you.
Cardinal George Pell is the most senior member of the Catholic clergy to be found guilty of abusing children. In September, he lodged an appeal to Australia's highest court. The former Vatican finance minister was found guilty in December 2018. An appeals court upheld the ruling in August. The 78-year-old was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He's no longer a member of the Holy Father's small advisory group, the Council of Cardinals. Mark Irons talked to Catholic news agency's Edward Condon.
Joining us now is Ed Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency and a canon lawyer. Ed, what can you tell us about this appeal, and what are the chances of the High Court actually hearing it?
Well, so in filing for leave to appeal to the High Court in Australia, Cardinal Pell really is making his last attempt to clear his name. Now, there's no guarantee that his appeal will be taken by the court. The vast majority of appeals to the High Court in Australia are rejected. They really tend to only take those cases which they think are of a special legal significance or national importance. But arguably, Cardinal Pell's case presents both.
And what arguments will his lawyers have to make to try to compel the High Court to get this appeal?
Well, his legal team have made it clear that they're pursuing an appeal on two grounds to the High Court. The first is that the majority of the appeal court judges that upheld his conviction erred when they basically said to dent their confidence in his single accuser, Cardinal Pell would basically have had to demonstrate the impossibility for him to have committed the crime, that he was denied the standard of reasonable doubt, that he was forced to demonstrate either the impossibility of him having done it, and anything less than that meant that the accuser was considered wholly credible. The second ground is that the appeal court erred in saying that he couldn't raise a reasonable doubt about the actual circumstances of time or place. Now, his legal team have argued all the way along the line that the time and place that he is said to have committed these acts of sexual abuse, that is, in a crowded cathedral sacristy after a Sunday Mass, is simply impossible, and it, at the very least, leaves a reasonable doubt.
And those two lower courts found him guilty. If he gets in front of the highest court, what are his actual chances? What can you tell us about the High Court? What's it going to look like?
Well, there's really no way of assessing his actual chances if he gets in front of the High Court. I'd say that really the first and most important barrier is for him to get there in the first place. Now, because there's been so much attention both in Australia and beyond on his case right the way along the way, there's definitely the sufficient attention for the High Court to say this needs a final resolution. At the same time, ever since the appeal court delivered its divided ruling last month, a lot of people have been saying that there are significant questions of justice at play here, that whether or not Pell really did get the chance to raise a reasonable doubt in his own defense is an open question and can have serious repercussions for Australian justice.
Let's look at a headline here. The Associated Press ran a headline today calling Cardinal Pell the most senior Catholic pedophile. Now, several news organizations, including the Washington Post, ran that headline without changes. What do you make of that language, most senior Catholic pedophile?
Well, I mean, I think anyone who takes the judicial system seriously, takes the appellate court system seriously, that's exactly the kind of language that does no one any favors. I think it's also fair to say that a lot of the treatment by the media, both in Australia and abroad, of Cardinal Pell's case from the very beginning has been characterized by exactly this sort of rush to judgment and presumed guilt. A lot of questions were raised during the time of the jury trial, both jury trials, in fact. The first one finished deadlocked in Pell's favor, made much of the fact that with so much media coverage against Cardinal Pell, getting a fair trial in the first place was almost impossible. I mean, we should remember that another Australian archbishop, Archbishop Wilson of Adelaide, was found guilty of obstructing justice and hiding instances of sexual abuse. He was subsequently cleared on appeal, and the judge said that he had basically been convicted on the grounds of media prejudice against the Catholic Church.
Thank you for your continual coverage of this. Ed Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency and a canon lawyer. Thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Coming up, 2 abuse survivors speak out about the controversial settlements they received. Two clergy abuse survivors speak out. They tell the Associated Press about the controversial settlements they received. The abuse happened 25 years ago. The two survivors say Franciscans paid each of them $15,000, but they had to sign papers agreeing to keep silent. The U.S. Bishop's 2002 Charter to Protect Young People bans confidential settlements like theirs unless the victim asks for it. Now we're hearing directly from these men in Mississippi. Poverty is everywhere in Greenwood, Mississippi, and it's something Joshua Love cannot escape.
I can't accomplish nothing here. It's like every time I come here, it's like I'm sitting on a rock.
So when a $15,000 payment was put in front of both Joshua Love and his cousin LaJarvis Love, it was hard to turn down.
Well, they probably feel like we ain't never had that type of money before.
They say it's because they were abused by two Franciscan brothers.
Sometimes when I'm sitting there in church, I cannot sit there a whole hour. You know, I just had to go outside and get some air because them brothers touched me in the church.
They were just 9 and 10 years old when it started, students at St. Francis School in Greenwood.
He abused me. He molested me. He touched me.
In 2017, LaJarvis shared his abuse claim. This year, both men received $15,000 settlements, agreeing not to share their story.
What could we do? You know, we don't have access to lawyers and things of that nature. So, you know, in a sense, you feel like you got to take what you can.
Most settlements between the church and clergy sex abuse survivors are far higher. The Diocese of Jackson lists the two Franciscans on their website of credibly accused. Brother Donald Lucas was found dead in 1999 of an apparent suicide. And Paul West left the order, but the AP found he was still teaching at a Catholic school until at least 2010.
Hi.
Hello.
Are you Paul West?
Yes.
We were wondering if we could talk to you about some things that happened down at St. Francis School in Greenwood, Mississippi.
I don't know what you're talking about.
You don't know what I'm talking? Didn't you work there for a while?
But now, 25 years later, LaJarvis is finally sharing his story. He says he's looking for help to be more of a rock for his own family. And cousin Joshua Love can sometimes be found sitting on his porch in a beat-up desk he calls his thinking chair.
It makes me feel like I'm still happy because it's a school chair.
I guess there's that child inside me that still want to sit there and learn.
Up next, analysis of the abuse crisis in the church and the actions U.S. bishops took this year. Welcome back. This year, the abuse crisis took a toll on the Catholic Church. In our EWTN News Real Clear Opinion Research poll, Americans largely disapprove of the way the U.S. bishops have handled the sex abuse scandal. A majority said the abuse crisis damaged their trust in the leadership of the Church. Let's talk about this with Matthew Bunce, executive editor for EWTN News. Dr. Bunce, thanks for being with us.
Good to be with you.
So, a year ago, the Holy Father asked bishops not to vote on resolutions to deal with the abuse crisis. They did then. He said he wanted to wait until all these bishops of the world met in February. Then the bishops did end up voting this June. What did they decide?
Well, you raise a very important point. We have to go back to provide context to that November meeting. They were poised to vote on a series of proposals, and the Holy See asked that they not do so. In that intervening period, we had the February summit in Rome under Pope Francis, dealing specifically with the clergy sexual abuse crisis. Out of that came a motu proprio, a papal document called Vos Estis Lux Mundi, You Are the Light of the World, that laid out a series programmatically of how bishops around the world should deal with the handling of cases, but above all, how they are going to be held accountable for themselves. That formed the structure for what the bishops then did in Baltimore in June. They did a couple of important things. First, they approved for the Church in the United States the implementation of Vos Estis. So in other words, they're now being held accountable under what's called the Metropolitan Model. They also accepted a third-party reporting system or mechanism for bishops accused of different forms of misconduct. They also affirmed what they call affirming our episcopal responsibilities, and that is a 10-point plan in which they once again promised to hold themselves accountable, but also to implement the norms. And finally, they began having conversations about what to do with former bishops who are in a state of disgrace, either as abusers or as those who mismanaged cases. So there was a lot coming out of the June meeting. Now the question is going to be how it's implemented.
And really quick, you mentioned this metropolitan model that deals with the metropolitan is the archbishop overseeing smaller dioceses, like the Archbishop of Philadelphia oversees various dioceses in Pennsylvania, and that archbishop would be the one in charge of investigating an allegation against that local bishop in a smaller diocese.
Right, and that was really one of the things that was nested in this motu proprio of Vocestis Lux Mundi. In the case, however, where a metropolitan is himself under accusation, the investigation is then headed by the most senior, what they call suffragan bishop, or one of the local bishops. A lot of questions remain about how the metropolitan model will function. In whatever reason, Theodore McCarrick was himself a metropolitan archbishop. So we'll have to see how it's actually rolled out by the bishops and what this looks like in practice.
And speaking of former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, the Vatican says, people in the Vatican say they're going to be releasing this report, finalizing their investigation. When should they be releasing that? What should we see in there?
Well, we heard from a few bishops, Bishop Boyer in particular, that the Holy Father was asked about that. There is a pledge, and has been for a while on the part of the Holy See, that this report will be released. What it's going to contain, I think, is one of those great questions that remains unanswered. We have been asking for about a year and a half for details about the McCarrick case, in particular, how it was possible for him to have remained in power for so long, to have wielded so much influence when so many apparently were aware of the accusations against him.
So many questions, so much hurt from Catholics that we talked to across the country. What is it, we looked at this poll number as well, that the Catholics, the trust in the bishops is dwindling. What do bishops need to do to regain trust of their flock?
Well, in our poll, we found that the bishops in the United States have a 55% disapproval rate from Catholics as to how they have handled the sexual abuse crisis. More than 60% of Catholics feel that the credibility of U.S. bishops has been damaged by the sex abuse crisis. That gives an idea of the dimensions of the problem that the bishops are facing in trying to restore their credibility. A couple of things that when you talk to bishops, and they discuss this themselves at the June meeting and at the November meeting, they need to be serious about the implementation of the norms we now have. They have the tools with Vocestis Lux Mundi to hold themselves accountable. That's something new in the history of the scandal. The McCarrick scandal itself really focused a very bright light on how the bishops themselves have handled this. And they need to be transparent, they need to be effective. We have seen very strong words, for example, from Bishop Scharfenberger when he took over in Buffalo. We have seen very strong actions from the Holy See relating to Bishop Michael Bransfield in Wheeling, Charleston, as well as Archbishop Laurie, who is the administrator there, and from Bransfield's own successor, Bishop Mark Brennan. Those are key elements, I think, in any strategy going forward on the part of the bishops. But above all, it's that commitment to preventing clergy sexual abuse, promoting healing and dealing effectively with the victims.
So right on the cusp of 2020, what big stories are we going to be looking for? We'll see that McCarrick report for one. What else should we look for?
I think one of the biggest stories of the year, really, aside from all of these events sort of inside the church, were events that were unfolding outside. And that is the lifting of statutes of limitations across the United States in places like New York, New Jersey, and California. What that has done is opened a flood of new cases and investigations. 2020 is going to witness more cases, likely more attorneys general investigating, more grand jury reports, such as we saw that the calamitous report in 2018. These are things that we are going to have to deal with as a church, not just in the coming months, but in the coming years.
Wow, it's so tough. But thank you, Dr. Bunce, for being with us and summarizing this for us. Thank you.
Good to be with you, and let's keep praying for the victims.
Very much so. Very many prayers tonight. Thank you. And I'm Jason Calvi, and for the entire EWTN News Nightly team, we thank you for watching tonight. We'll see you tomorrow. Good night, and God bless.